Okay, I think we are live now. Yete, are we live? Should we start?
We are live. You can start.
Oh, thank you. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of FRIBIS Institute of Basic Income Studies, I welcome you all to the panel on gender and UBI. We are fortunate to have a very eminent panel today. We have an academician and an activist amongst us. Barb and Toru, both of them, anybody who is interested in UBI might have come across their work. They don't need an introduction, but as the chair of this session, it is my privilege to introduce them. So our first speaker today is Professor Turu Yamamuri. Toru is a professor in economics department at Doshisha University, Japan, and a former visiting fellow at Cambridge University. His research primarily focuses on intersection of heterodox economics and feminism. His work has won the 2017 KW Prize from European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy and the 2014 Basic Income Studies Best Essay Prize. Today, Toru will present his historical research on the forgotten voices and struggles of women from British Liberation Movement who succeeded to become to make the UBI as one of the official demands. Our second speaker is Barb Dickerson. Barb is a fierce UBI advocate. She has experience on both sides of UK welfare system as a claimant and advisor, as well as working in a variety of other jobs. She has organized around women's health, welfare, and housing issues for over 35 years. Barb is a board member of Basic Income UK and was the founding chair of Unconditional Basic Income Europe from 2014 to 17. She is also currently news editor for Basic Income Earth Network. Barb will make a presentation on UBI and gender based on her 9 years experience with the Wages for Housework campaign and her later historical research. So without much ado, we will start with our first panelist. The panelist will speak for 25 minutes. And since Toru has to leave early, we will take questions after his presentation. The participants in the session can type their questions in the chat box, in the YouTube chat box, and then we will be asking them to the panelists once their session is over. So over to you, Toru.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Rejitha, thank you for her wonderful introduction. And I'm very honored to share the session with Barb Jacobson, who I admire most, militant and long-term devoted activist. And also, thank you very much for organizing this wonderful virtual conference in this difficult time, which enabled me to join from the opposite side of the earth. Let me share my screen, my slide. Am I sharing properly now? Yes. So today I'm here to introduce forgotten women who militantly struggled for unconditional basic income at the intersection of the women's liberation movement and the claimant union movement in the long 1970s Britain, and also to reconstruct their thought as a grassroots feminist economic thought. Yes. The history of economic thought as a discipline has concentrated on the thought of a professional economist. Recently, there has been some admirable effort to broaden the scope of whose thought should be considered as appropriate to the discipline. One of these efforts is feminist economics' endeavor to shift the focus away from male economists. Also, there are some initiatives by young scholars for decolonize and diversify a history of economic thought. Encouraged by these attempts, here I wish to broaden the discipline's boundaries even further by suggesting that we ought to also be considering in earnest economic thought articulated by grassroots movement. One might dismiss such a move by following John Maynard Keynes' famous remark that practical men are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. While it is sometimes true that grassroots movement channel pre-existing economic thought, I wish to argue the case for grassroots economic thought at times preceding ideas and concepts only subsequently developed by economists. The case presented here is one at the intersection of the women's liberation movement and the climate union movement. I have previously conducted extensive oral history research on women who organized the climate union movement and joined the women's liberation movement in the long 1970s Britain. These women with men articulated the concept of what now we know as unconditional basic income, UBI, drawing on the broader concept of a guaranteed income. A decade before, academics did the same. At the National Women's Liberation Conference, they made the feminist case for unconditional basic income and succeeded in passing a resolution to make basic income an official demand for the British women's liberation movement. While my previous paper, this one, dealt with in detail with historiographical particulars and showed how the women's achievement was sidelined by the white middle-class mainstream in the movement, which eventually resulted in the collective amnesia of these working-class women and their achievement. Here, I would like to reconstruct the grassroots feminist economic thought that underpins the women's basic income demand. In this presentation, I hope to demonstrate, firstly, that understanding the articulation of basic income would widen, if not change, the mainstream understanding and historiography of the idea of basic income. Secondly, that the grassroots economic thought prefigured ideas, some of which subsequently developed by feminist economists, as well as other ideas that have yet to gain traction in academia. Thirdly, how their grassroots economic thought was unique at that time and a product of the intersectionality on class, gender, race, and disability. Thus, finally, I wish to suggest grassroots economic thought ought to be properly acknowledged within the history of economic thought and feminist economics. Now, who am I talking about? They have been out of sight of not only historians of economic thought, but also almost all academics, including historians of women's liberation movement and feminist economists. Let me start with this poster in the slide. It was made for the International Women's Day demonstration in 1973 in London. The photo in the poster, obviously two women, one holding a baggie, the other holding a placard demanding equal pay, free contraception, etc. Small letter on the bottom of the placard read, Women's Liberation Workshop, and their phone number in London. It probably means London Women's Liberation Workshop, which functioned as a hub for numerous women's groups in London at that time. So the photo seems to show two women in the protest organized by London Women's Liberation Workshop. Does anyone object to my guess? Probably no. Now, this on the left from issue number 4 of Spare Rib, a feminist magazine at that time. The photo was taken as Climate Union protested against the so-called cohabitation rule in August 1972. There were women and men. The slogan was "End the cohabitation rule." In a small letter on the placard, it was written as "Fight with the Claimant Union." So as you see, men are deleted, the slogan was changed, the name of organization was changed from Claimant Union to Women's Liberation Workshop. Well, I should praise it was an incredible skill. Decade before, Photoshop application was invented. I imagine there is no sinister motive behind this manipulation. The reason I am showing this editing is not to read any intention of the editor, but to read as an ironical coincidence with a collective forgetfulness that happened later in history. What have we collectively forgotten? Unconditional basic income as a women's liberation demand and claimant women's struggle and economic thought that made them to articulate their version of basic income. The empirical part of my research is based on oral history on members of claimant unions and archival work. People who kindly allowed me to interview are more than 30 people, and I'm showing some of them who agreed to show their photos for this conference. This is Julia. This is Jane. This is Roger. This is Julia again, and this is Susan. Yes. What is claimant union? The claimant union movement is a movement started in 1968 and continued at least for 20 years in the UK. The first claimant union was formed by several working class people in Birmingham in autumn 1968. In a year, its number grew to 150, half of which were women, and claimant unions were spontaneously formed in the other part of the UK. In March 1970, they formed the National Federation of Claimant Union. Number of unions in which are around 90 from 1972 throughout 1970s. The number of the members in each union varied from 5 to 10 to 400. The membership of claimant union is, in principle, only consisted of claimants themselves. Typically, each union had a weekly meeting which is open to any claimant, and where moral judgment are to be avoided, thus each can safely share one's own situation with trust. Based on the collective decision at the meeting, the union faced welfare officers collectively. Or probably I should explain what claimant is. Here, claimant means people who claim the benefit, either it would be accepted by the welfare office or not. Yes, while the majority of its membership is working class women, there is fairly diverse and intersectional composition of membership, at least in unions in big cities such as London or Birmingham. Unemployed, strikers, school leavers, disabled, transgender, women, men, white, Black, Asian, native, immigrant, working class, middle class, etc. I think you can see from some of those diversity you can see from the photo, like this one or this one or this one. This is from the Birmingham. This is again from Birmingham. This is from East London. In the meeting, sometimes they also discussed further behind the predicament each has to suffer and envisioned a blueprint of what they think a better society. The claimant charter that National Federation of Claimant Unions adopted in March 1970 represented the early stage of their collective discussions. There are four charters. The first one is the right to adequate income without means test for all people. Second, a free welfare state for all with its services controlled by the people who use it. The third, no secret and the right to full information. Fourth, no distinction between so-called deserving and undeserving. The former two were relatively big and long-term goals, while the latter two are more practical demand on how the process of welfare benefit assessment should be. Women in Claimant Union had women-only activities from consciousness-raising meetings and conferences to direct actions. These women attended almost all of the National Women's Liberation Conferences from its beginning in 1970 to the last in 1978, and organized workshops on claimant in each conference. Some of them joined the so-called Fifth Demand Group, purpose of which was to actualize financial and legal independence of women. That is the fifth demand of the British women's liberation movement. In April 1977, at the 9th National Women's Liberation Conference, Women in Claimant Union raised a resolution for asking the whole British women's liberation movement to endorse unconditional basic income in order to end sexism in social security and to go a step further, the fifth demand on financial and legal independence of women. The resolution was passed. None of academic work or published memoirs recorded this fact until I published it in 2014. The article shown in the slide is only a published record of this resolution. It is in a spare leaf feminist magazine again. But it is a strange article. It doesn't contain any information on who raised the resolution and its reason, and even what basic income is. Instead, it explains who opposed and why. According to the testimony of my interviewees, women in the Claimant Union raised the same resolution at the National Women's Liberation Conference prior to 1977, and it was also passed. However, it was opposed and wiped out by the chair of the conference. Let me move to reconstruct the grassroots feminist economic thought. Around the 1970s, ideas that were circulated and recognized widely were not unconditional basic income itself, but guaranteed income and negative income tax. Guaranteed income is the idea that no one should not fall below a certain threshold of income. Negative income tax is a specific version of guaranteed income, and UBI is another specific version of guaranteed income. So this is UBI, and guaranteed income not only include this one, but also include this one. So it's much wider umbrella concept compared to basic income. The idea of guaranteed income, as in the meaning I've just explained, can be traced back to 1952 when Clarence E. Ayers, an American institutional economist, advocated it in his book. It gradually got popularity in the early 1960s, along with several proposals, such as Milton Friedman's negative income tax and Robert Theobald's guaranteed income. The Claimant Union endorsed the idea of guaranteed income from its beginning in 1968, and it was 1970 when they reached the conclusion that guaranteed income they advocate should be in the form of what now we understand as unconditional basic income. Thus, this one. The main reason of it was because, main reason of why the guaranteed income they advocate should be in the form of unconditional basic income was because only this version of guaranteed income can be free from harassment and discrimination which claimant women suffer, such as Social Security Office's surveillance against their relationship. Also, later when Wages for Housework campaign was launched, claimant women criticized it because of its risk to reinforce sexual division of labor, while they rightly acknowledged that many in the Wages of Housework movement also against such a division of labor. Well, probably Barb will tell this more. In mainstream strand of women's liberation movement, there are prevailing either opposition or indifference against any kind of guaranteed income. Some of my interviewees recall that those middle-class women did not understand the need of working-class women. One of them also recalled the role of transgender women in claimant union, given the discrimination that put many of transgender women in no prospect to be employed at that time. A feminist philosopher, Nancy Fraser, proposed for a universal caregiver model in which she argued against what she charted as most US feminist and liberalist goal for universal breadwinner, and as most Western European feminist and social democrat goal for caregiver parity. Against those models envisioned by existing feminist discourse, Fraser's own new model for caregiver allows everyone can be caregiver without being disadvantaged or without what feminist economist Nancy Folbre calls care penalty. The history explored in this presentation shows us that the universal caregiver model already existed in the working class feminist discourse in the long 1970s Britain. So let me conclude. I hope I successfully made a case for what we should take, why we should take grassroots feminist economic thought seriously. It would give us a different picture on history of the idea of unconditional basic income and more broadly of the idea of feminist economic thought. Collective amnesia on claimant women can be explained partly because of rich intersectionality of their composition and thought. If I am allowed to borrow the word by Louis Toupin's description for a Canadian branch of Wages for Housework, we can say claimant economic thought as an intersectional perspective before its time. More than a decade after these claimant women's struggle, the International Association for Feminist Economics, we call it IAFE, was launched. And this association has accommodated a good number of discussions on unconditional basic income since then. However, there has been no recognition of neither the fact that it was an basic income was an officially and democratically endorsed demand for the British women's liberation movement or agency of the working class women who made it, nor their economic thought. Last year, responding to the current COVID-19 pandemic, the International Association for Feminist Economics made a statement on universal social provisioning, in which the immediate and urgent implementation of a gender equitable universal basic income and the provision of essential service is called. This is really encouraging move. And now time and academic attention is catching up with Claimant women's struggle in the long 1970s. Dankeschön. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toru. This was an amazing, wonderful insight that you have given us all. It is interesting to note how certain narratives are conveniently dropped or wiped out from collective memories. And it's researches like this that brings it back to the fore. And thank you so much, Toru, for the efforts that you have taken. I just, till the questions come in, I think we have yet to receive any questions, but I just wanted to ask you, you have mentioned the claimants, their demand seems to be the same that we have been asking so far. But what kind of resistance did they face? What kind of opposition, and what was the reason that it died down? Can you just elaborate it a bit for?
Yes, Rejitha, thank you for warm word and thank you for important question. There are a couple of reasons, I think. Well, that article I showed in Sphere, it said that many in the floor in that conference share the spirit behind the resolution, but they also fear it could be very close to the demand by wages for housework. And there have been the tension between the British branch of wages of housework led by Selma James and the mainstream in women's liberation movement at that time. So that it was recorded as such, so that it was one of the main reasons. And so in a sense, those Claimant women are perceived as sort of ally of wages for housework. However, those Claimant women's own perception is more nuanced and complicated. At least in a big city where Selma herself always turn up in many occasions, there are strong dispute between some leading figures of Claimant women and Selma James. Well, of course, it's based on the mutual respect, as far as I understand, but the opinion different between them. And of course, strategically, they do things together time to time, but in the many part, they differentiated themselves. And well, and then in the rural part, rural is not correct word in English, but probably it's if it's not a metropolis, the movement is much smaller and things are more harmonious and they work together. Yes, and keep those difference in long-term goal aside. So yes, that is one reason I would say. And but other thing is, as far as I heard, as far as the testimony of some of the interviewees, those middle-class women many of them are graduate of Cambridge, Oxford. They have a kind of, they're happy to, they would like to include working class voices, but they have a kind of idealized, romanticized views of working class. And yes, those climate women actually came from working class, but somehow they are different from those middle class women idealized. So that I don't know how far I could convey more, but yes, there are kind of unfortunate misencounter between those people who have power and discourse in those in the women's liberation movement and those climate women. And well, if something would be a bit different, the history would be different, I would say. It's not really determinant, but with some contingency, things came out like this. Yeah, that's what I understand.
Thank you so much, Toru. That was very insightful. Thank you. I don't think we have any questions from the audience yet.
Let me thank you again to Barb. So that I interviewed also some from Ways of Housework, and Barb was one of them. Whereas even Barb's active years is later than my research period in 1970s. But thank you again, Barb, for your kindly sparing time with me. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Toru, it was a pleasure, and it was a pleasure to have that opportunity to meet you. I'll be talking about other divisions within the women's movement, both in the US and the UK later on. But yeah, I think the problem with Wages for Housework was the kind of focus on the work as opposed to existing and the rights of living. You know, because it turned out, although Salma actually, in one of her earlier works, which I'll be talking about a bit later, she did demand a guaranteed income for everyone. Somehow, yeah, later on that kind of then got kind of subsumed into the work, all right, and counting the work, which again I'll be going over, but yeah, I mean, it's a real problem. You know, I think it was a real problem on both sides of the Atlantic, and I'm sure in other countries that the women's liberation movement, you know, became very much subsumed by middle class, you know, the middle class women, and they're wanting to, you know, to have jobs and to have better jobs and better pay in those jobs. I mean, not that that's, you know, not that that's not a good thing, all right, but just, you know, it really kind of shifted things from a demand for real liberation in our lives to demanding work. And, you know, we see that, I mean, Silvia Federici later criticized the involvement with the UN's, what were they called? There were these big conferences of women starting, I think, in 1975, if I'm correct. And then they sort of happened then there was one in Nairobi, and then there was another one after that, where again, you know, sort of women's demands for the right to life and the right to have kids, as well as, you know, the control over our bodies, were kind of, again, subsumed into a demand for work, you know, for professional work, which again didn't really sort of take into account the demands of working class women, for sure. So, and it, you know, or Black women in the US, all right, that's something I'll be talking about later as well. So thank you, Toru, that was great.
And thank you, Barb. And if I may, just with my replying to Rejitha's question, there are some focus on the kind of conflict between mainstream and these women. And yes, that's one of critical point. But let me also say the opposite things, you know, also at least in the early 1970s, there are sisterhood between them and unite together. And I could show many of that example in order to do justice. And this is called Misbehaving. It's memoirs from who joined the famous Miss World contest in Royal Albert Hall in 1970s. Actually, the Misbehavior is the title of the movies. It's shown in the screen in the last year or the year 2 years ago or something in the UK. And actually, well, there are several activists, real activists was focused in the film. And actually 2 of them later joined Clement unions. And so yes, there are kind of relationship between part of the mainstream economy, mainstream women's liberation movement and the Clement Union. So yes, there are real conflict and diversity, and how basic income demand was sidelined is based on that conflict part. But if we see history more broader perspective, yes, it's not only the conflict and division, but also solidarity and sisterhood, which kind of, I would say from 21st century perspective, it's almost a miracle, I would say. And I admire those women who make these solidarities. And it's the same for not only the relationship with mainstream women's liberation workshop, mainstream women's liberation movement, but also these Clement women and men also try to have a broader solidarity with mainstream trade unionism. And again, there are unfortunate conflict or lot of those incidents, but still there are many small victories they can make the solidarity successfully. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Toru. Thank you so much, Barb. I think there are not any questions on the YouTube chat, so we can move. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, could I ask Toru a question, which I've never asked?
Yeah, please.
Very weirdly, maybe. Toru, how did you come to find out about this question, or come to study, do the studies that you've done into the question of the claimants union women?
Yes, thank you for asking. Well, it's all contingency. First encounter is I visited I visited Bill Jordan, who was a secretary of Newton Abbott Clement Union, and also having the professor in Exeter University. And my background was an activist for kind of casual workers union in Japan. And I told my background to Bill, and Bill said, I might be interested to meet some similar-minded activists who were active in 1970s. There happened to be the ex-members of Newton Abbott Clement Union. So I visit with Bill Council Estate and meet some of them. That's a starting point. And then, I was a postdoc researcher in Cambridge at the time. With a friend, I organized some workshop, and where I present the Clement Union history based on the testimony of members of Newton Abbott Clement Union. And then I got since then, it was on the internet, and since then I got a response from one of the founding members of Clement Union in Birmingham, and basically criticizing my paper of commit through mistakes. So I go to meet that's experiment, and some of them kindly introduce networks of many ex-claimants in all over the UK. That's how I started. And yes, yeah. Thank you for asking, Barb.
Great. Well, no, it's fantastic research, and I'm really grateful that that you've been able to do it. Yeah. So
I think we can just now move to the next session. Barb, your session. So we can start your presentation.
Okay, let me just share.
Thank you so much, Toru. It was great having you. Thank you so much. You have to leave in between, so I'll take this opportunity to thank you for sparing your time and for this wonderful discussion.
Yeah, thank you so
Rejitha.
much.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you all, and thank you, Jet.
Okay, let me just share my screen, and also if you present, there we go. Okay, this will be some of my history, personal history. This will be some other history, women's history, but also demands that were made by different people over the last couple centuries. But yeah, so we're never noticed until we're not there. All right, so this is really the story of women, work, and money. This is very much focused on the US and the UK. I'm originally American, but I came to London in 1981, and as a student. And so then in 1982, let me just see, how do I do my slides? It's not working. There we go. Yeah, and so in 1982, I met the Wages for Housework campaign. It really seemed to answer a lot of questions. I had been involved with some women's movement in the US, very tangentially, but a lot of it was very much in the late 70s and 80s when I first met it as a very young woman. A lot of it was very much involved with blaming men and trying to change the attitudes of men, blaming patriarchy, without really much in the way of economic analysis, and really sort of looking at women's position from the economics, rather than just sort of blaming physiology and power. So it really spoke to me. My mother stayed with my dad much longer than she wanted to, basically because she needed to share his wage. In the early 70s, wages, as Toru talked about, Wages for Housework kind of grew out of the women's liberation movement wanting to have an economic viewpoint on it, and also trying to uncover the work that women do, which capitalism depends on. They made the point that factory workers, male factory workers, could never get there, get to the factory without the work that women do at home, and that basically capitalism depended on the free work that women do in order to affect production. Of course, women were also working in the factory. This is a picture of the Grunwick strike which lasted from 1976 to 1978. Mainly East Asian, not East Asian women, women from the South Asian women who had actually come via Uganda mostly, when they were kicked out, and they had to take jobs at what was a film processing factory in West London. This had a huge impact on the left in trade unionism. At the time, the Trade Union Council and other unions did not support the strike. They didn't think it was winnable. But there was also, obviously an element of racism under this. And although the strike didn't succeed outright, women who carried on at the factory did win certain rights after it was over. Toru talked about Selma James. This is one of her early works before the Wages for Housework campaign. She talks about demanding wages for housework, but then we also need, as she says here, a guaranteed income for women and for men, working or not working, married or not. And again, this is really coming to the idea that basic income or guaranteed income needs to be paid on an individual basis, which is something that we're kind of, you know, in the various pilots, sometimes we're losing a bit. So yeah. And Salma was a very divisive person. I mean, she's still alive, actually. I think she's about 92 or something. But she really, yeah, as Toru talked about, I mean, she was really disliked by a lot of the early women's liberation people. Basically, because again, a lot of the middle class struggle was to get out of the house and to have professional jobs, whereas this was a demand which was basically coming up from below. Another factor in all of this was the National Welfare Rights Organization in the US, which was led by Black women, although there was actually a majority of women on welfare were white. And here she says, as far as I'm concerned, the ladies of the NWRO are the frontline troops of women's freedom, both because we have few illusions and because our issues are so important to all women: the right to a living wage for women's work and the right to life itself. And this also comes in the context of the demand for abortion, you know, for the right to abortion. Black women at the time and still are really under at the time, very much at the time, they were being sterilized, and they were also making a fight to the right to have the kids that they actually wanted, not just to be able not to have the kids that they couldn't, you know, that they felt they couldn't give birth to. And this was I think we kind of still see this in the discussions about abortion. We have, on the one hand, we have people who are trying to ban abortion, who want to, you know, protect the fetus. But then once the fetus is born as a baby, they really are quite happy to, you know, to leave them in the gutter. Okay, so the right, you know, so you have this kind of dichotomy between, you know, this rights of the fetus, but then the rights of the living child have been kind of forgotten. But I think it's also been a problem in the women's movement that the demand to actually have the kids that we want to have and to be able to look after them has been kind of left on the sidelines. One of our slogans was in the Wages for Housework campaign was "Every mother is a working mother." Again, you know, just trying to uncover what, you know, the kind of free work that mainly women were doing, not just women, of course, but mainly women were doing, and yeah, to try to count that work. Of course, when I came in on the scene, this was about 1982, Thatcher was in power by that time and trying to cut benefits. She used to be called Thatcher the Milk Snatcher back in the 70s because she ended free milk in schools. But then when she became prime minister, she really did, she really did a lot to undermine women's position, which also had kind of made the point for us that the demand, you know, simply to have a better job was, you know, in the male, you know, in a male-dominated world was not necessarily going to lead to women's liberation. Okay, going back even further in time, when I left Wages for Housework campaign in 1991. And after that, I did quite a bit of research into Thomas Paine and the society around him. And one of the things I found there was a really interesting pamphlet by Thomas Spence called The Rights of Infants, or what it says here, the imprescriptible, that means unalienable, right of mothers to such a share of the elements as is sufficient to enable them to suckle and bring up their young. This is a really, I suggest people look it up online. It's in this Thomas Spence Society archive. And it's actually a really funny dialogue between what he says here, the aristocracy and a mother of children. So he was saying basically that that mothers in particular, but everybody had the right. He was one of the first proponents of what we would call now an unconditional basic income, where everybody in a particular area had the right to a share of the profits from the land. And sometimes he's kind of forgotten. He was never as famous as Thomas Paine, although in fact, sort of after he died, there was quite a kind of Spencean movement, which resulted in several demonstrations and even riots after the Napoleonic Wars, sort of around 1819-20. One inspiration that we certainly did acknowledge in the Wages for Housework campaign was Virginia Woolf and her book A Room of One's Own. Also, she wrote a book called 3 Guineas, which was also about women's economic position and war. But this, where she says, for my belief is that if we live another century or so and have £500 a year each and rooms of our own, if we have the habit of freedom and the courage to write exactly what we think, then this opportunity will come. And just to note that we're kind of 8 years off her prediction. We're kind of 8 years off her prediction and her hope. And I personally, I hope it won't take quite that long. But the point is that she was arguing for women's autonomy. Again, she, it's not necessarily a class division. She was certainly from a very upper class family, but wanted this for every woman, whether working class or otherwise. Another great inspiration. This is Eleanor Rathbone. She argued for, and again, this quote is from the same time period as Virginia Woolf. She argued for and eventually won, and unfortunately it was just a few months after her death, she won the right to family allowances to be paid for women. This turned in the 70s, this turned into child benefit, and that's in large part because of the amazing work by the Claimants Union with the support. That was one of the things that the Wages for Housework campaign did combine with the Claimants Union women on. So she says, I doubt that whether there is a subject in the world of equal value, of equal importance that is received so little serious and articulate consideration as the economic status of the family, of its members in relation to each other, and of the whole unit in relation to the other units of which the community is made up. So she was, again, there were a lot of, she faced a lot of opposition from the labor movement. It's something like what we sort of face now with the whole UBI versus Universal Basic Services debate, which has happened in the UK, in that the labor movement back at that time wanted, thought that there should be, say, free food or in schools, or there should be other free services. They were arguing for a national health service, which also, eventually materialized. And she was saying, well, it's not one size fits all. If we have the money, then we can choose what food that we eat and have, or whether we, do sports or all sorts of things. All right. So what I really recommend is her book, The Disinherited Family. Which is what this quote is from. She was a great woman. Okay, back to Wages for Housework. This is a clipping from the 1970s in the US. And this has always been a kind of, not so much a problem, but it's always been a discussion. Whether do we count, we were trying to get women's work counted as real work that was valuable to the economy. But then you have this other thing, which is, do we, and this is one of the points that Silvia Federici made later, was, do we actually go along with what are basically capitalist valuations of that work? So if it was paid for, a woman would be paid up to, at that time, $48,000, which in the 70s was a massive, massive salary. I mean, probably it's around, $50 to $100, $50 to $100,000 in today's money. So in 1984, I believe, 85, we started a petition to get women's work counted in the GDP as productive work. And one of the ways we thought would be best to struggle for this would be to have something called Time Off for Women, which was essentially inspired by the Icelandic women's strike. There was also a women's strike in Switzerland about 10 years later. But it was really a kind of chance to get women across all the intersectional boundaries to come together. And as you can see here, we did try to represent that in our literature and graphics. Another thing that Wages for Housework campaign was very much involved with was the rights of sex workers, particularly women sex workers. It was another thing that kind of brought us into conflict with the mainstream women's movement, which was trying, often talking about trying to suppress pornography or to suppress prostitution. And this is a cartoon from that time, from the mid 80s, where women, on the one hand, there were women who were who were marching in the streets to try to shut the sex clubs down, and women here is, working as a stripper and saying, look, why don't you focus your attention on the people really in power and not women like myself. So there's a club that needs good cleanup just down the road, girls, Westminster. This was after a big Reclaim the Night protest in Soho, which is where there was there were a lot of sex, there was a lot of sex industry there, both prostitutes and strippers and all kinds of things. So, but this is also, it's kind of, this is a division which still happens, but it's hopefully not quite as virulent as it was back then. Another thing that we were involved with very much was the fight to make rape and marriage a crime. This is a book by Ruth Hall, The Rapist Who Pays the Rent, and we did a survey of women and just uncovering the fact that women are actually most in danger from the person that they live with, not the guy on the street. I mean, before this, the kind of image of women's safety is always, was about this kind of stranger danger on the street, whereas this really made the case that, in fact, most violence against women was actually happening in the home. For us, this meant that women needed their own money, and that Wages for Housework would be one component of that. Another thing we were involved with was the peace movement. This is a poster from about 1983, I believe, which again shows that men and women can combine against us as well as work together for the rest of humanity. This says, so this is from Gone with the Wind. And so it says here, she promised to follow him to the end of the earth, and he made that happen. He promised to organize it, yeah. So the peace movement was a much bigger thing then. Unfortunately, the wars have continued, but the peace movement seems to have kind of fallen away somewhat. We were making the case that the money to pay women could easily come from the military. I would still make that case, and I think sometimes we should probably make more of that case within the basic income movement. But this is an old demand. Again, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was making, this is a button, the button I just showed was from the 80s. This is from the 60s. So they were saying, feed the cities, not the Pentagon. And yet we still have to deal with colonialism. This is a fairly recent poster, I think in the last 5 years or so, about how much money is going out of Africa versus what's coming in terms of aid. So you can see that really The developing world is still subsidizing the rich countries. So we have a kind of country class divide as well as class divides within each country. But this is a lot of the reason why we get to this situation where there are women traveling continents, traveling across oceans and over continents in order to get the money for their families to survive. They're largely dependent on other members of their family to look after their children. They miss the raising of their children, and it's quite a tragedy that people have to cross oceans in order to make the money, you know, and then miss out on the kind of family life that they would rather prefer. The basic income movement has off, you know, the latest phase of the basic income movement has very much kicked off on the idea of automation and the end of jobs. But again, there are a lot of jobs which simply cannot be robotized, and we also have to think about, you know, whether, you know, which jobs do we not want to robotize. Sometimes, you know, well, obviously, you know, there's pleasure in looking after each other and to shifting more over to a care economy as opposed to just an economy built on profit. And then, of course, we have the problem that was pointed out by David Graeber in his great book, Bullshit Jobs. This is a kind of organogram of different of the way job titles have shifted in nearly 60 years, and how, you know, a lot of useless jobs, and particularly sort of, again, at the upper income level, how many, you know, what Graeber pointed out was that many people felt that their jobs really didn't have any use or any value to the rest of society, besides pulling, you know, the individuals who are actually earning that income. We also, you know, at the moment, the environment is very much on people's minds. But again, this is really a choice, or a so-called choice of, again, here you have a choice, a job that will feed your kids for 3 years, building something that will kill them, or building something that will kill them later, or starve now. And so the guy's asking how much later. This is really a real question right now, you know, in terms of, you know, maybe with the Corona crisis and things getting shaken up, we have we have a chance to rebuild or to figure out, you know, what jobs are really necessary. Unfortunately, during the Corona crisis, it was governments who were deciding who was necessary and who wasn't necessary. So that meant the killing of many small businesses in favor of the tech giants like Amazon and Uber and other tech giants who were able to organize food and other things being delivered to your door. And this is very much, you know, people made the point that, you know, say liquor stores were kept open and Walmart was kept open, and yet, you know, the local hardware shop or the local grocery shop was closed down and said to be unnecessary. So I think, you know, we really need to kind of grasp hold of that, and just, you know, hairdressers, for example, were considered to be unnecessary. And, you know, I know last year a lot of us ended up having to grow our hair out against our will, okay, because we couldn't get someone to cut our hair. So I mean, this idea of what is necessary versus what is unnecessary, I think is going to be a growing question as our societies move forward. And then on top of this, in the great, you know, there are a lot of dreamers on the left that in the great scheme of things, possessions and money are meaningless. It's, you know, again, I mean, I hope we all work towards a world where maybe money doesn't mean as much as it does at the moment. But in order to get there, I think we all need an equal share of it. And that's really the basis of my support for basic income. And then lastly, this is, again, the cruel irony of housework. People only notice it when you don't do it. So, there's a lot that we don't notice. And I think in some ways the crisis has kind of helped in the sense that at least early on, even Tory MPs were noticing that they actually, they did, the absence of their cleaners and their nannies, that in fact, this was in fact essential work that's going on. And that we found that, that the work that's actually needed to be done by society is in kind of inverse relation to the amount of income, because the work that needs to be done by society is largely unpaid, underpaid, or very insecure. And we see this around the world. But we would really notice if it didn't happen. And we certainly did notice it when it didn't happen last year. So that pretty much concludes my slides. There's a list of sources, which I have to go over again. But yeah, I think I'm open for questions now. Grand, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Barb. I mean, to go through you with this journey where you take us through your own experiences and let us know about how the discourse evolved is priceless. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I just had this one question, because in India also this wage for income for housework has been coming for some time. There was a discussion and then it goes away because of the same kind of objections that we see. That is of commodification of say human relationships like love and care. You can't commodify that, and the thing about it will institutionalize gender roles if you try paying for housework. So how would you address that as somebody who has, I'm sure, faced these questions a lot?
Well, it's really funny because when we were out on the street back in the 80s and talking to women directly, that objection never came up. Okay. That we did have the two. I mean, we did have the, on the one hand, you had women, where do I sign up for wages for housework? When do I get it? On the other hand, you did have women saying, well, how dare you put a price on my love? All right, because of course the housework and the childcare and everything represented their love. In terms of institutionalizing women in the home and all of those sorts of objections, I'm sorry to say, in my experience, they're mainly coming from middle-class academics, women who maybe are worried that they might lose their jobs or have pressure to give up their jobs, all right, if there is wages for housework or it is a basic income. I mean, we hear the same about basic income for sure, for everybody. But again, it's I think basic income, if it's seen more as a kind of part of our share of the economy, all of our share of the economy, there are other, and there's an equal argument, I think, for the fact that, what we've achieved technologically has come off the backs of thousands and thousands and thousands of ancestors, going back for the generations. All right. Why should it just be those who own the patents, all right, or those who own the factories? Why should it just be, why should they get the lion's share of that while we're kind of left to, starve or do 2 or 3 jobs or, not have a share of that, really. So, again, it's about people being able to make choices in their lives and really being recognized both from the past, but also in the present. What is our share? Okay, our share of the economy should be really much larger than it is right now, and it should be up to each individual how to decide what to do with it. So, if there are a lot of women who feel very stressed, with their jobs, trying to look after their kids and their family, and why should we have to live under that burden of stress when, many women, and men, and I think men also miss out really, particularly in terms of the lives of very young children. They miss out on all their milestones and in that amazing time, particularly between babyhood and 5 years old, where, there's something new every day. And they have to kind of hear about it secondhand, you know, from whoever is actually looking after the kids. So, yeah, you know, again, the whole kind of institutionalizing women in the home. I mean, is it, you know, it's really, again, about choice. I mean, like I said about Black women in the US, you know, who were under great stress, they were being sterilized by the state, all right? They were not being allowed to have kids by the state. As, you know, that a lot of the women's movement, you know, again, the kind of mainstream women's movement was, although, you know, in not so much in the early time, but in certainly later on, has kind of completely forgotten about, you know, the right to actually look after who we want to look after. Nina Pretorius has written a great pamphlet on the relationship of women to the environment. And, you know, one of the things she makes a case for basic income, and one of the things she says is that we, you know, we have the right to look after ourselves, each other, and the environment, all right? And this is all work that usually gets done unpaid. So we really do have, you know, I think we really do have a right to a share of the share of the economy, which is currently unrecognized. Now, whether that, you know, needs to be codified in the way that, you know, the early wages for housework, and certainly later on when we were trying to get women's work counted in the GDP, you know, whether that should be codified in terms of, well, you know, a housewife is worth so much a year, or not. I think, again, if we think of it more, not so much for the work, but more as our rightful share of the economy. And, you know, again, this also reflects off of the different struggles, you know, whether that's in Alaska or in Goa, about, you know, having a share of the Earth's resources. You know, we also should have you know, there's no excuse for not having a share of the money resources, because money is, of course, something that people have invented, all right, and is really the only resource that there is really unlimited. And this is certainly also what the COVID crisis has shown, you know, can be magicked out of thin air, and if we need it, then we should be able to use it. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So I'm just again curious about, so when in the wages for housework movement, how did they come up with a figure, or it was just an open demand for?
No, they didn't actually. This was something more that the kind of newspapers came off of, and then actually it became much more codified in divorce law. All right, so that women, you know, because of their unpaid work while a man was building up his career, that, you know, that when they got divorced, then the woman should have so much because she was worth, you know, her labor, if the man had paid for it, was worth so much. Okay, so that's more how that came up. And it's kind of commonplace now in divorce law in the UK and the US, you know, to kind of recognize that unpaid work. But yeah, I mean, it's still a struggle, obviously, but yeah.
I think we also have parallel Supreme Court judgment in India also, where they have calculated how much it was basically an insurance case, but they had to calculate how much the housewife who lost her life would have.
For sure. But I mean, the other thing is, you know, I mean, that also is dependent on having, you know, that your ex-partner is earning a decent amount of money, or has a decent amount of wealth. Okay. You know, this doesn't really apply, you know, if you're getting divorced and neither of you have anything at all right, or you're on very low income, there's really not much to be had. I mean, no matter how much that work was, you know, was actually worth to society. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily translate into a male wage. It often just gets diffused into the corporate structure, really. So, yeah.
But we have one question from Sabine Heidner. She has asked about, I think it's about vaccination. Just see if you can answer this. She's asking, is there any movement in regard to the now giving vaccination by women? Because I was informed that this special vaccination will occur sterilization for women and men. I'm not really sure.
Well, I mean, I think it's, it's kind of part of the whole struggle to, have control over our health and our bodies. It's more about the mandates. I mean, I think it's not so much, it's not so much about whether you get vaccinated or not, or what's in the vaccination, and maybe it, can help you, maybe it can't. But, I think there's a real discussion, which unfortunately has really been suppressed, and I think in most places in the world, that it really is, the vaccine is, the different vaccines are not proving to be stopping transmission, and they're not proving to be stopping illness. So therefore, the mandates, all right, which is, again, I don't know, I'm just sort of, personally, I'm kind of feeling like, well, if productive, like as in making goods, all right, if productive capitalism is starting to lose its profitability, we are now becoming the kind of point of profit, all right? So our bodies are becoming the point of profit, as opposed to actually making things that are useful for people and growing food. So I think it is going to be a big question going forward. It's a big question right now, because in Europe, I mean, and I think in Pakistan, there's some massive mandates. I don't know about India, but Pakistan government said that they'll turn your SIM card off if you don't get a vaccine. I mean, the pressure for this vaccine is unbelievable. It's like nothing I've ever seen. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot we don't know about it. Yeah, but it's still a struggle for control over our own time and our own bodies. And so I think we need to look at it through that lens, as well as, the so-called public health lens. I hope that answers Sabina's question.
I don't think there are any further questions, Barb. So
Okay.
We can just end our session.
Great. Can I just ask you, Rejitha? Yeah, I did hear there is a province that's talking about wages, about giving money to women. Do you know more about that? There is a province in India, or there's a place in India.
Tamil Nadu had, in the last state election, there was a new party which was formed by an actor, a South Indian actor, Kamal Hassan. He was standing for election. He has founded a new party. And his party had proposed, I think, 3,000 rupees for housewives.
Housewives, yeah.
Yeah.
And how successful was that? Or?
So it didn't. He didn't come to powers. We don't know, but it was one of his election campaign. It was proposed. It was one of the schemes that he was proposing, but he didn't get elected. So we never know. But similar kind of, I think, addressing women. There was also a scheme that was proposed for girl children in Bengal, which was again certain amount of money that will be given for girl child. And there was also this thing, and there was such schemes specifically targeting categorical for a group has been proposed, but specifically for home workers, for women who take care of their household. The specific was this one from Tamil Nadu. If you want more about it, I can just share with you some news items that I have.
Oh, great. Yeah, that would be lovely. Excellent. Because I did see something, there was some woman leader who was talking about this as well. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the area that she was representing. But
it was women leader. It might have been Mamata Banerjee from West Bengal. She was West Bengal chief minister, was also talking about cash transfers, especially for women.
Yeah.
And but that was not, I think, for people taking care of, the home workers. It was basically for girl children or something. I have both of those information. I can share it with you.
Brilliant. Yeah.
I have your email. I'll send it across.
Yeah. But see, that's the thing. It's like for me, if we need a basic income to go to all right. So you don't get this kind of division between women and men. And I think, going back to your earlier question, again, there's always been this thing in the women's movement here in the US and the UK that we need to convince the men to do a bigger share of the housework. Okay, so this is always like an attitudinal thing. All right. In our case in wages for housework was, well, if you pay if you pay wages for housework, then men will want to do it. All right. So, and similarly, I think if we had basic income, it would give, men an opportunity to actually share in that work much more, and more of an incentive to actually, share in that work. So, yeah. So I worry about things, which are just to women. So.
No, but I also think it also depends on the amount, right? I mean, I don't think it would be that high lucrative for a woman, for a man to take that up, but might just give them an opportunity to say, now the state also thinks that you are supposed to do the housework because you are getting this wage. So that kind of argument could also come up. So I'm not really sure, but I think a universal basic income, irrespective of man or woman, anybody who does socially productive work should get an income kind of a discourse would be more acceptable in current times than I think house work. At least in India, I think that the same kind of debate always comes up when there's a proposition for this.
Yeah, no, I agree. So listen, so thank you everyone. Thank you FRIBIS for having me on, and Rejitha for sharing so well. Yeah, and I guess we'll come to a close now. I don't know. It's up to you.
Thank you so much, Barb. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yete, for being behind the scenes as well.
And Yete has been coordinating everything from, the technological help. I think we would not have done it so smoothly without her. So thank you so much, Yete. Sure. You've been great. And thank you so much, Barb.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Brilliant.
So we'll just end the session.
Okay, yeah. And I'll be speaking later on today. So at the very end session about money. So we'll see how that goes. Okay.